an American president and an administration who is, hell-bent on pushing fossil fuels and on kind of destroying climate science, American climate science. He's defunding all of the. We are now in this era of real-time climate damages. We're seeing more and more extreme heat waves. We're seeing more rapidly intensifying storms. We're seeing more epic droughts and where all these will be taking us. This is a threat to me. This could kill me in the wrong circumstances. The political system in America has been deeply corrupted by fossil fuel interests and by fossil fuel money. Deal with climate change. The step number one is reducing emissions because
Yes.
emissions are what is causing the warming, and the
Warming.
warming will continue until we go to zero emissions. These oil companies and gas companies don't want to invest in renewables because they're not as profitable. Trump is, to be blunt, trying to take America back into a kind of dark ages where science doesn't matter. Wildfire smoke is far more dangerous than we understood even a couple of years ago.
So, hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Science Talk. I'm your host, Dr. Mohammed Ittifaq. Today, this episode, we will discuss several key issues, including heat, climate change, climate policies, and a little bit about climate politics. As we all know, what is going on in the US, particularly with the climate change, global warming, and climate policies. We are going to talk about heat, but not the heat you want in probably in your pickleball games, but the heat which can kill all of us, or some of us, or maybe first the most vulnerable one. So, yes, I'm talking about the extreme heat waves and also how the extreme temperatures are increasing the frequency and intensity. My guest today is accomplished journalist, New York Times bestseller author, writer. You are all familiar with his work over the last 20 years, Jeff Goodell. Thank you so much and welcome to Science Talk.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Thank you. So my first question, you have been a journalist, or you still write, and I want to start from there that if you're a journalist today, how would you report on climate change looking at, the scale of information or misinformation coming out from various sources?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I have been writing about climate change for 20 years, and this is an unprecedented time.
Mhm.
It's very different than it ever has been before. We have an American president and an administration who is, hell-bent on pushing fossil fuels and on kind of destroying climate science, American climate science. He's defunding all of the climate organizations in the US, and it's a full-scale assault on science in the United States. And so, that changes the dynamic in a big way. First of all, it makes science and thinking about climate change more political than it has ever been. It's always been political in different kinds of ways, but now it's explicitly political. We have a very powerful political force, trying to deny and undermine any kind of scientific thinking about the impacts and risks and consequences of this. So that changes, how we as journalists think about this in a big way. I mean, obviously, part of it, our job is to still sort of focus on science and insist on science and call out the distortions and lies. But it's very different than it was even, a couple of years ago. I think journalists, all of us who cover climate, feel the changing dynamic. We feel kind of attacks from people. I get way more hate mail now than I did before. So it's a very different game.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a matter of focusing. Do you focus on, correcting these lies, or do you focus on hardcore investigative stories which are impacting the communities, after hurricanes and floods and droughts and things like that? So absolutely. Would you say this is the worst time, or can it get worse than this?
Oh, it can definitely get worse. Of course, it can get much worse. Uh, where this is going to go, in large ways and small ways, is obviously impossible to say. politically, very dynamic with what's going on, how long Trump's sort of reign will last before, will it last through the midterm elections? What will the political dynamic in the US be? But also, we're pushing on the edge of a lot of more extreme climate impacts, right? I mean, we're seeing more and more extreme heat waves. We're seeing more rapidly intensifying storms. We're seeing more epic droughts, and where all these will be taking us is also, a big unknown. And
Mhm.
that too is different than it was, 10 or 15 years ago, where these impacts of climate change were more or less things that you talked about and saw in models, right? It wasn't happening really in real time around us the way it is now,
Yeah.
you
Yeah,
know.
absolutely.
So
Uh,
that's very different.
yeah, it is. It is. So, yeah, so you wrote a book 2 years ago almost, right? 2023, on heat. And that was your seventh book, talking about climate change. And within 20 years, you have written hundreds of articles. You have met the most powerful people who, decide how the things are going to go in terms of policies. So talk a little bit about why the last book was about heat. I watched a lot of your interviews before I get prepared for this one. You have explained that how you didn't think by yourself about heat for the longest period of time, and then you realized when you were in Arizona that how extreme it can get and how harmful it can get, and then you struggled with the publisher, like about the title. But I want you to kind of, for the audience again, explain why it took so long for you to realize about heat, and what do we expect from ordinary people who are not writing about climate change, who are not as literate as you were about climate change, and still not realizing how important and significant impacts on your health can be from heat.
Well, I'll tell the story a little bit about what happened, about how I came to write the book briefly, to start this conversation, or this explanation. I had been writing about climate change for more than 15 years. When I happened to be in Phoenix on a very hot day, I was late for a meeting. My Uber was late. I decided I was going to run about 10 blocks on this day when it was about 115 degrees Fahrenheit. And after about 3 blocks, I became dizzy and, out of breath, and my heart was pounding. And I realized for the first time that this heat was really dangerous. And, if I kept running, I could be in big trouble, or if I had had any kind of health problems. And it really struck me, that I had not really ever considered this, even though I had been writing about, global warming, which is obviously implies heat, for a very long time. And I think that it was emblematic of the sort of first stages of thinking about climate change, which is even me, who had been all over the world and talked to many people and been to the Arctic and Antarctica and Africa and all over. It always seemed something that was happening to other people in other places, and something that was maybe, something of grave concern to my children or grandchildren, but it wasn't an immediate threat to me.
Mhm.
And that day in Phoenix was the first day I really realized this is a threat to me. This could kill me in the wrong circumstances.
Yeah.
And that was a profound revelation. And you can say it was born of my own kind of naivete, but I don't think I'm unusual. I think that a lot of people thought about it that way. And so the birth of the book happened right there on that sidewalk, because I realized, well, if I don't understand this, then I
Mhm.
bet a lot of other people
Yeah.
don't understand it too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. One of my friends, he's a assistant professor at Arizona State. He got actually dehydrated and hospitalized last year because he moved there and he didn't realize that how hot it is over there. And it just happened last summer. So yeah, that's also called proximity, in journalism, that when it's something happens close to you, you're moved, instead of, something happened in Argentina or Bangladesh. People's like, it's not here yet, maybe next 20 years, but now it's here, and it has changed a lot, as you just said. So let me ask you a question. Like almost 10 years ago, you went on a trip to Alaska with President Obama, And I watched that 10 minutes video on Rolling Stones where you explained, and he was talking about climate change. Um, he spoke about climate change so eloquently. He realized that this is a problem. But then he also say that that was me, people. That it was just kind of coal and gas production went high in his tenure as well. What did you, if you can talk about that trip a little bit, and what did you learn? What is missing from the political elite? Especially from a Democratic president who realized that it's happening, it's here, but still was not able to do much.
Well, that's a great question. I mean, so that trip was really, remarkable in many ways. It was during the run-up to the Paris Climate Agreement, and President Obama was trying to kind of build support for the U.S. position and to show some leadership on this, and to also to bring the Chinese along and make the Paris not a repeat of Copenhagen, which was a disaster.
Yeah.
So he wanted to bring a reporter along to kind of get this message out, and for complicated reasons, I suppose, he chose me. So I got to spend a couple of days with him in Alaska. It was a really extraordinary trip because, first of all, he was loved being in Alaska and kind of out of his prison of the Oval Office and running around on glaciers and doing things like that. But it was also extraordinary because he granted me, a lot of time to talk to him. We had, among other things, an hour and a half straight just sitting in a kindergarten classroom by ourselves after a talk he gave in Kotzebue, Alaska. And and my feeling at the time was that he was extraordinarily well informed.
Hmm.
You could talk to him. I did talk to him about all kinds of aspects of this. He understood climate science. He understood sort of global politics, obviously, but he was, very committed to making Paris work,
Hmm.
right? And I felt that very strongly with him. And he did make Paris work to the degree that anyone would agree that Paris worked at all. I mean, I think that was the best agreement you could get out of that moment. He did bring China along. Th That was an important aspect of this. And, when you look back on it, it was the kind of apex of kind of international cooperation on climate. Obama did not follow through in the ways that I wished he would have. He did push, export of oil and gas. He did, open lands to drilling that I wish he didn't. So, he was not perfect and he was not flawless. And I look back on it and I realize that he could have done a lot more.
Hmm.
But on the other hand, when I compare it to where we are right now in America, I see how far we have fallen.
Yeah, absolutely.
The idea that I could sit in a kindergarten classroom in Kotzebue, Alaska with President Trump and have a conversation about marine science and about, the rate of ice melting in the Arctic and about extreme heat and about the complexity of international climate negotiations, but the importance of America showing leadership. I mean, it's not even being
Thinkable.
in the realm of possibility, right? I
Mhm.
mean, it would be, if anything, a Saturday Night Live skit,
Yeah, I mean, maybe if they offer him, like, they can renovate the East Wing or the West Wing or give another
Yeah,
plane,
yeah, yeah.
or give him a hamburger and something to motivate him to go there. But it's very unlikely scenario, of course. And from the same trip you did with Obama, he said, and I'm quoting, American people don't care about climate change. If they care, politicians will care. Do you think we, like politicians putting on the people putting on the politicians, they are in the power, they can do stop drilling, right? They can stop drilling, they can help us phasing out from fossil fuel, go to clean energy. Is it a good idea from a politician who care and who acknowledges and who is well informed on these realities, and still putting on people that if they care then politicians will care? And from the surveys, we know almost 70% Americans think and believe that it is happening.
Well, I mean, I don't think it's a one-way street. I don't think it's one way or the other. I don't think it's like people need to push politicians or politicians need to show leadership. Both of those kinds of things have to happen. And I think that there's one thing to say. I mean, I do think the polls show that, 70, 80, in some polls, 89% of Americans think that climate change is a significant issue.
Yeah.
But what that actually means is way more complicated. Does that mean, oh, you're willing to, if some politician said, we're going to outlaw internal combustion engines in 5 years in order to get emissions down? Well, clearly that's not going to happen, right? Because we've seen the rollback of EV policy and in the U.S. already under Trump. Trump has a lot of support. So it's all very unclear. But what is about the sort of push me, pull you aspect of it? But it is clear that A, political leadership is necessary. B, political system in America has been deeply corrupted by fossil fuel interests and by fossil fuel money.
Yeah.
And so the conversation is not a, shall I say, kind of honest one, right? It is full of misinformation. I just listened to, 15 minutes of Joe Rogan podcast yesterday, where he had a couple of climate denying scientists on there, very well known, one named Richard Lindzen. And, Rogan, who has an enormous audience,
Absolutely. 20
is
million subscribers, at least on one platform.
right. It's probably more than you, I think, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. A little bit more than me. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe a little.
Yeah.
Um, but Rogan is saying this is all about money and control, and it's all fake, and he's showing all these, Washington Post stories with um, graphs of the Earth's temperature, completely misinterpreting them. I mean, completely science illiterate. But he's got 20 million subscribers. He's being listened to by so
Millions
many
of people.
people.
Yeah.
And so you have this polluted, to use a deliberate phrase, information environment out there
Yeah.
that it's very difficult to battle
Yeah.
without
Absolutely.
political leadership.
Yeah, and I think part of the reasons that like the trust in science and trust in leadership and also in media has dropped historically low, and people look for alternative sources of information, going for these Tucker Carlson or these podcasting, a new wave of information, and they have more audience than whole CNN, or BBC, like on one platform. And just imagine 10 different social media platforms, 2 3 million people watch on each platform. It's like hundreds of millions of people combined. And I think part of the reason some people also talk like this celebrity kind of science, those people who are on the maybe parole of these fossil fuel companies, they go on these Fox News or other podcasting and just pollute that information and not telling, and people, the ordinary people, don't have much time to verify what they're saying.
Right.
And that's part of the problem. And I was talking yesterday. I give a talk on misinformation related to science, and there was a BBC small documentary where they analyzed. If you know or familiar with a podcast called Diary of CEO,
Hmm.
coming from UK, very big podcast. And he hosted different doctors talking about vaccines, talking about, different issues. They found that each episode has at least 14 bogus or false claims about health, just
Right.
from one podcast. So it's like kind of the scale of that is huge. But now you mentioned about energy a little bit, and I want to talk a little bit about that, because when we talk about energy, we mostly refer it as electricity, right? And energy as a whole is a big topic. It's infrastructure, it's like, cars, it's like outside your home. Even we are phasing out, and I think last year report or this year, people, many people, including myself, like happy that we are producing more renewable energy. But like we only talking about electricity. Like, do you think that this renewable transition would help us to some extent or to large extent to deal with the climate crisis, or do we need to do multiple things at the same time, just not talk about, energy only?
Well, I mean, certainly, when you talk about how to sort of deal with climate change, the step number one is reducing emissions because
Yes.
emissions are what is causing the warming, and the
I mean,
warming will continue until we go to zero emissions, right? And
yeah.
that's important to understand. So that is obviously and clearly step one in thinking about this. And the tremendous decline in the price of renewable power, especially solar and wind, is incredibly heartening. Another journalist named Bill McKibben
Yeah.
has a new book out called Here Comes the Sun that talks about the sort of solar revolution that we're undergoing right now, which I highly recommend. And I live in Texas, right? Right now I'm talking to you from Austin. And, this is not exactly a tree hugger state here.
Yeah. It's
And, 40% of the electricity on the grid, more or less, on any given day is coming from renewable power. And that's because it's cheap and it's people can make a lot of money off it. So that is a very hopeful thing. What is problematic is that this addition of renewable power and this cheap renewable power is not really displacing fossil fuel energy. And we're seeing this tremendous rise in demand for electricity because of AI and these data centers, which is becoming a kind of reason to build or a lot more natural gas plants and things like that. So the problem is that we're not getting off of fossil fuels at the same time as we're creating this cheaper renewable power. And the other thing that is simply true is that the fossil fuel industry is very profitable. There's a lot of money to be made in it. And renewable power is not profitable in the same way. It's a very different cost structure. And so, it's particularly difficult to displace fossil fuels even with renewable power. But eventually that's where we're going, and eventually that will happen. The problem is how long will it take?
It'll take. Yes, I'm just kind of pulled out the report from Guardian. They say global use of coal hit record high in 2024, as you just said. That as equally, like if we're producing more renewable energy from these clean sources, but we're also using more coal at the same time. And the number one thing people need to understand that until we do not rely on fossil fuel, it's not going to stop. Um, and is that a part of the reasons that it's so easy for politicians to sell economics of coal and gas, that there are more jobs, it's more profitable, it brings more money, more dollars than the renewable energy? It's not going to bring as many jobs as the coal and gas industry bring. Even though there are some reports which show that these companies are laying off people but making more profits.
Yeah, I think it's very clear that on renewable energy, there's way more jobs in that dimension, and it's also true that the future is all about renewable energy. That is. There's no, I live in Texas. I talk to oil executives, casually at parties and dinners and stuff all the time, and they all know that their industry is sunsetting. It's
Yeah,
just a question of how long it's going to take,
yeah,
right? And so is it going to be 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years? How long will it be?
yeah,
And so that's the dynamic,
yeah,
and they don't want to invest, these oil companies and gas companies don't want to invest in renewables because they're not as profitable.
yeah.
People ask why doesn't, Shell or BP or whoever, why don't they become leaders in renewable energy? Well, because their shareholders wouldn't stand for it because they can't make as much money at it right now.
As they're making from fossil fuels. Absolutely. Given your experience over the last 20 years, um, are you still hopeful or depressed or realist or doomer? Where do you stand, and what is the like reason behind that?
Well, I mean, first of all, hope is a complicated word, and
It
depending,
is. They say
different
they,
kinds,
they say in the business school it's not a strategy, but yeah.
right? There's the kind of hope that, Santa is going to bring you a new bicycle, and there's the kind of hope that, uh, I mean, there's just all different kinds of
Yeah.
hopes. So it's a complicated question, right? So, people do always ask me, I've been writing about this for so long, why are you not sort of living in your basement, drinking bourbon and scrawling on the walls with crayons, right?
Yeah,
And
exactly. That's exactly on my mind too. Yeah.
right. Well, there's two reasons. One is conversations like this. I mean, I think that one of the things that keeps me very, to use the word hopeful, is having conversations with people like you. Everywhere I go, whenever I give talks, I see large audiences of people who are really deeply engaged in this, who really care about this, who understand what's going on and are fighting to build a better world. And that's tremendously inspiring, whether it's, a technologist, a guy who's starting a solar company, or students on campus, or scientists, or I just meet all kinds of people who are just incredibly inspiring and fearless and tough and strong and understand what's going on and are determined to fight for it, right? And so that is very inspiring. And the second thing that I really do think is that I do think this is an opportunity to build a better world. I mean, there's going to be a lot of suffering and loss in our change as a result of our changing climate. There's no question about that. But it's also an opportunity to do things differently, right? And when I drive around Austin here, driving down Lamar Boulevard full of strip malls and stuff, I don't look at that and think, oh, this is the perfect arrangement of civilization. It would be a shame if anything happened to these 75 blocks of strip malls, right? I mean, there's different ways of living, better ways of organizing our lives that I think we can do with this. And you see that in adapting to heat, adapting to sea level rise. You've seen structures built in different ways, more shade, more human, more natural ventilation. I mean, small things and large things that are really, thinking differently about our relationship with the world we live in. And I find those kinds of things, those kinds of projects really, and that those kinds of dreams really hopeful.
Absolutely. So, when you drive around or you go outside, do people recognize you and talk to you? Do you have like sometime conversations with people since you live there? It's very different living in Texas, person like you. So, do you have conversation? Did you have any encounter like a pleasant one or the bad ones?
Well, yeah, I'm not exactly, like George Clooney walking around Austin, right? I mean, it's
But still, I mean,
sometimes
like, yeah.
sometimes I'll bump into somebody who has read my book, or sometimes I'll bump into somebody, who I know. But Austin's a great place to live for this because it's sort of like being, if you were like in the military in World War II, it's like being on Normandy Beach. It's like where all the action is. There's the oil companies are here. There is every climate impact you can name. We're going through a drought right now. We have, of
Yeah.
course, extreme heat. It's one of the hottest places in the country. We have wildfires. I mean, it's really the belly of the beast. And so for me, it's sort of, in a journalistic sense, very exciting place to be.
So, one of your book you wrote, and I was fascinated on the subjects you have chosen to write on these things. You wrote about, cooling the planet. You wrote about sea level rise. You talk about heat. You talk about, like the hardcore issues which are related to climate change, right? And one of your book, of course, How to Cool the Planet, you talk about geoengineering, right? That's a new technology. Some people are very optimistic. Some people do not think, not very excited about that. What do you think, since you have written that book, do you think we have made progress with technology, especially with geoengineering, or we are not on the track?
Well, so first of all, my book about geoengineering was like 15 years ahead of its time.
Yeah.
If everybody who's watching this, buys a copy of the book, that would like triple the sales total. I mean, it did not, people did not care about geoengineering when I wrote that book 15 years ago, but it is now becoming more and more central in our conversations. And the issue is not really the science or the technology, really. The issues are political and moral.
Mhm.
The basic idea, for people who don't know, there's all different aspects of it, but the one that is most central to conversation right now is creating what amounts to artificial volcanoes. We know that when a big volcano like Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines erupted in, I think it was 92, 91, it cooled the Earth's climate by about a degree for a year until the little sulfate particles rained out. And so the idea is maybe to use a fleet of high altitude aircraft to put tiny sulfate particles high in the stratosphere. They would act as little mirrors, basically reflecting away just 1 or 2% of the sunlight, which would have a measurable effect and have a kind of global cooling on the planet. It's a very dangerous idea. It is an idea that has all kinds of political and environmental consequences. One of the simplest ways to think about it is like whose hand would be on the thermostat, who would decide how much, cooling to undertake. Another big problem is that once you start doing it, you have to keep doing it because these particles rain out of the sky. So you have to more or less continually do this. Has potential to shift monsoon patterns around, which would have a big impact on agriculture, food production. There's just a whole bunch of, moral and political complexities to this. That's what's really held it back, for better or worse. I personally think that the science should be investigated more. I'm okay with sort of small scale experiments. We haven't even really done that yet, but just to get a better understanding of how these particles distribute and things like that. A lot of people see that as a slippery slope to deployment. I don't feel that way. I feel like, w with the right conditions, small scale experiments to learn better how this works. Because I do think, sadly, but honestly, that it's inevitable that we'll do something like this. And so the more we know about it, the more we understand it, the better.
Yeah, absolutely. But those experiments will be done by the scientists, and those scientists are unfortunately leaving the US, or trying to not to be activist because their grants are being held at many institutions. And I'm sure you have been looking at that information and watching what is happening with science, attacks on science, and scientists are leaving. Even Nobel laureates are leaving the US, and the US is the US because of science and research and development, from different experiments, going to the space and exploring diseases, and like putting out the solutions related to climate change. But are you worried that what is going to cause in the next 10 to 20 or 15 years, looking at the scale of attacks on science and the scientific institutions in the US, including NASA, CDC, every institution you name it, it's being highly politicized, and how is it going to look like in 10 to 15 years for those scientists who are in their PhD programs or early career scientists who are going to lead the world in the coming years?
Well, I mean, it's going to have devastating consequences, obviously. I think it's going to, America has always been a kind of leader in, scientific thought and technological development. And I think we're seeing that right now eroding in real time. It's going to be a tremendous brain drain on universities. Universities are under attack in all kinds of ways. I think it's going to shift leadership on scientific thinking, on climate change, and all kinds of other things to other places,
Yeah.
to China, to Europe. I think it's going to have tremendous economic consequences in the US. I think it's going to have tremendous public health consequences in the US.
Absolutely.
Things like the anti-vax movement that's happening here. We're already seeing outbreaks of measles and other things. I mean, that kind of thing terrifies me also. Just in a literally like myself and my children kind of scenario. But I think that this is devastating. It's, Trump is, to be blunt, trying to take America back into a kind of dark ages where science doesn't matter. And what matters is, what he says. And
Yeah.
that is going to echo for a long time. The upside of it is, I think that, when this moment is over, there's going to be an opportunity to rebuild all of this in an entirely different way. I'm hopeful that that will happen in America. I'm pretty confident that it will happen. I'm actually confident that a kind of backlash to this is brewing. We just had this No Kings March last weekend that was very inspiring, but yeah, you're right. I mean, I know a lot of scientists, and they're all thunderstruck by what's happened and making plans to leave or to, change their research proposals, or it's just devastating. Of the people that I know in the climate world, it's the scientists right now who are feeling it the most.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, like better than I do. Like, you need a free mind to think creatively, to think about solutions. You spend hours and hours and days and months and years in labs to come up with scientific discovery, to save lives. And when you're bombarded with this type of attacks and misinformation, or character assassinations and other things, it's hard to work, it's hard to focus on, especially if you have a family or kids. You're constantly worried about your students, your lab, your work, and all that, and it's sad state of affairs. Recently, there are many reports about talking that we already passed the threshold of 1.5 or 1.6 every month. Even October 2025 is the hottest again. Are we still going to control the temperature below 3 degree by 2050 or 2100, or are we going to meet that threshold earlier than what we expecting to warm the planet in general?
It's impossible to say. Who knows? I mean, it is certainly clear that for all intents and purposes, that 1.5 degree, threshold, we're going to blow past that. Whether though, I think the projections right now are that we're headed something for around 2.6 or 2.7. But that's, these are all long-term forecasts and they're dependent upon all kinds of things that are impossible to calculate, right now, right? I mean, these are best guess, best, effort estimations by really smart people, but all kinds of things can change. But we talked about the price of renewable power. None of the EIA, none of the agencies forecasted this kind of radical decline in the price of solar power, especially. So that's a kind of hopeful, scenario that could change that projection. But, you know, um, it's certainly not good that we are, um, you know, have a the richest nation in the world is pushing fossil fuels, and is doing everything it can do to become a kind of petrostate and to urge others around the world to do the same.
Yeah.
So, I think the other really important question when we think about these thresholds is, first of all, these thresholds are not magical, right? It's not
Mhm.
like
Of course.
once we pass 1.5 or 2.0 or whatever, the world stops spinning and everything falls apart.
Yeah.
There's no difference between 1.49 and 1.5 and 1.51 for all intents and
Mhm.
purposes. But the real thresholds that we don't understand, scientists don't really understand it, and that are, where the real uncertainty lies is in threshold behaviors of physical systems. Like I went to Antarctica and looked at Thwaites Glacier for on a research trip for a couple of months, and there's a lot of questions about how unstable that glacier is, and it holds it's the size of the West Antarctic ice sheet's the size of Florida. It has 10 feet of sea level rise. Right there in the ice, and it's increasingly destable. What is going to happen with these longer droughts? How long are they going to last? The heat dome in the Pacific Northwest in 2021 was a great example of these kinds of unexpected events. We had, 7 days in Oregon and Washington and British Columbia that were 20 to 30 degrees above the average temperature. I mean, there were 800 people died. It was an event that nobody predicted ever. And yet it happened. And so these kinds of unexpected manifestations of this new climate we're living in are, to me, where the sort of what's scary.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah. And
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 then
and I think I think
you
that
talk
brings
about things like disease
yeah.
vectors and things like that.
Yeah, and I think that you speak a little bit about the idea, Professor Dana Fisher. She also talks about, and through a shift that maybe if a big event happens somewhere, so we will realize that it is happening and we will wake up and do something. What do you think about that?
First time when I first started covering climate change 20, more than 20 years ago, I went out on a research vessel in the North Atlantic to do some sedimentary coring in the North Atlantic with a scientist from Woods Hole. And we were sitting out on the back of the boat one evening, and his name was Lloyd. And I said, Lloyd, what do you think it is going to take to kind of wake people up to the real risks of climate change? And he said, well, when a big hurricane comes and wipes out a major American city, people will wake up. Well, you know what? We've had like five of
Yeah,
those since then. We've had, Sandy and Katrina and Harvey. I don't think that there's going to be an aha moment. I think everyone has their own aha moment, and some people will never have an
yeah,
aha moment. But for me, it was for me, it was seeing the coal fields of West Virginia. I didn't care about climate change at all until I went to West Virginia to
Yes.
write about the coal industry. And I saw these mountaintop removal mines, and it really like changed my view of energy and everything. And that was my kind of oh shit moment.
Yeah.
Um, but everybody has their own,
Yeah.
and I don't think there's going to be this. I see no evidence of a grand awakening.
Yeah, and I think I agree with that. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the coal as well. You wrote a book on that. And I live in Virginia, very close to West Virginia, and some of those counties are terrified, shattered because nothing was there after, they closed the coal mines and things. The poverty went up, and it's just like 20,000, 25,000 US dollars of family household income in some of the countries, which is terrible. And I mean, who cares about, what is happening if you can put the food on the table?
Yeah.
So if you can talk a little bit how when we, go somewhere, extract the resources, promise jobs, and then after 10, 15, 20 years, there's nothing there, and then we move on, but those communities, we leave them behind. How does that like impact people's understanding about economics and climate change?
Oh, it's a huge issue. But let me just say that, I mean, first of all, I did write a book about the coal industry. It's called Big Coal. I wrote it in 2005, so 20 years ago now, but it's still kind of sadly more relevant than
Yeah.
ever. This has been a deliberate strategy of the coal industry
Mm,
from the very beginning, is to keep other industries out
mm,
to keep people dependent upon the coal mines because then of course labor unions and all kinds of other kind of worker rights, they have much less leverage if it's like, well, I work in the coal mine or I go hungry, so then
yeah.
you're going to work in the coal mine and you're going to accept whatever conditions the coal industry tells you you're going to accept. So this is clearly, and this is nothing remarkable that I'm saying. Lots of people who've written about this have said this. It's been a deliberate strategy for
Mm,
a very, very long time. And now, in the situation you're talking about, is you're seeing the consequences of
yeah.
that, right? I mean, one of the things that Biden did that was really great was a lot of money from the Inflation Reduction Act went towards other kinds of projects in
Yeah.
Appalachia. There was a lot of money targeted at Appalachia in, not just, renewable energy stuff, but all kinds of economic development projects.
Mm,
And so, you know, there's been a lot of attempts to diversify the economy there.
mm,
That's all been killed off now by Trump. But, it's a real problem, and it's been a political problem for a long time. And it's partly, as you know, living on the edge of Appalachia, it's also a geographic thing, right? It's hard. It's a very complicated geography
yeah.
there. It's hard to, you know, various kinds of industries have a difficult time because of roads and just the
Yeah.
airplane, just the flights and all kinds of things.
Yeah.
Um, but it is absolutely true that this sort of what amounts to a kind of economic blackmail,
Mm,
you work for us or you don't work,
yeah.
has been the sort of political dynamic in that region for a very long time. And just let me say the last thing, which is one of the revelations for me in working on this book about the coal industry was it was my how much respect and frankly love I had for the coal miners that I met. I went underground with a bunch of them, and they're the most amazing people. And you know, um, the fact that the New York Times just had a story 2 weeks ago or a week ago about black lung still
Mhm.
being prevalent in West Virginia, and the benefits and the coverage for medical care for black lung being cut by Trump. I mean, that's just unconscionable.
Yeah.
It's
In 2025 it's still happening.
yeah.
So is it like kind of I mean, it's just not zero sum game, but like who's failing who here? There are very few powerful oil and gas companies, but there are hundreds of institutions and authors and scholars and people who care about climate change, but they are not making as much influence to these power corridors compared to fossil fuel industry. They're so strong. Is this because they have so much money or they have good PR or like how they know how to manipulate these politicians?
Yeah, I mean, all of the above. I mean, a journalist like myself has no power compared to, a major oil or gas
Or
company.
a
I mean,
PR professional in, from ExxonMobil.
right. But, myself alone, I don't have very much power at all. But, when we have 7 million people on the street like we did last
That's
weekend,
yeah,
we do have a lot of power. But, look, these companies have spent a century basically,
yeah,
you know, um, shaping the laws, developing lobbying connections. They are hardwired into our political system in a way that literally nobody else in America is.
mm,
And so until that power begins to wane,
mm,
it's going to be very difficult to fight against that. But that's why the fight right now about climate change and about, and the energy transition is inseparable from the fight for democracy. And they're the same fight right now. They weren't before, but they are now because
yeah,
we have an administration that is hell-bent on creating a petrostate in America.
yeah.
And until that changes, that's a very powerful force that is, we're seeing it every day. I mean, just yesterday, the Trump administration kind of delayed international shipping
Yeah.
emission regulations just by threatening, tariffs and stuff on countries that cooperate. I mean, there's an all-out assault on this in every dimension.
Yeah. And I mean, it's the most powerful country, but right now, like, kind of drowning us into a lot of, bad shit. Excuse my French, but like, yeah, I mean, that's so terrifying. So, with that, I'm going to conclude by asking you a question that I'm asking every one of my guests that what are we not talking about, and we should be spending more time talking when it comes to climate change.
Well, I think that, the two things that are, I think, right now the most pressing and potent
Hmm.
sort of subjects for thinking about climate is money,
Hmm.
sense of we are now in this era of real-time climate damages. We're seeing places on the coast where you have roads washing out over and over again. You're seeing real estate markets in frequently flooded areas beginning to collapse. We're seeing skyrocketing housing, home insurance rates. This question of who is going to pay for all this
Yeah.
is, I think, really a pressing question that goes beyond science and really goes into the economics and politics of this, and it has not been talked about enough. And I think the other thing that's really, important that it doesn't get talked about enough, even though it gets talked about some, is, how climate change is impacting us, you personally, your health, your well-being, whether it's, we've just, for example, discovered that wildfire smoke is far more dangerous than we understood even a couple of years ago. Public health risks of our continuing reliance on fossil fuels and on climate change, I think, is something that is not explored enough. And my book was, for me, emblematic of that. I mean, I think my book was successful because of the title,
Mhm.
The heat will kill you first. It was made it personal and it made it about your health.
Health, yeah.
I think that people don't really get that. And I think that's a very potent political issue, whether it's, breathing in pollution from a fossil fuel plant or, declining test scores for your child in school because the air conditioning isn't working,
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think well, many of my colleagues who are working here that if your heat exposure gonna get you hospitalization, even if you do not have insurance, elderly or sick or, people who are most vulnerable, if the temperature goes, 20-degree Fahrenheit more in this summer or something, you're gonna get hospitalized, and that is going to ruin everything. In terms of your health. And that work, unfortunately, most of the time stays in the papers, in desktops, and journals, do not reach, the general public. That's why I started like doing this to share some of the insights and work with people saying like these things are happening in real time, with us, and it's gonna happen more. in a more unpredictable way. So thank you so much for your time, Jeff. It was a pleasure talking to you. I will post a link of your books in the description so people who want to read or order those books can. So thank you so much again. It was a pleasure talking to you.